So in your textbook Rules of Play, Salin and Zimmerman define systems in this way. Systems occur when objects interact with one another in an environment based on their attributes to create internal relationships. So I've made some highlights here. Objects, environment, attributes, and internal relationships. This sounds a lot like game design theory, and it certainly is. And not everybody thinks that that's very applicable. But if we're applying it to something like, say, a Unity scene, we can start to see where this idea applies and can be used to analyze how game ideas are implemented in our actual game development tools. So our objects are the game objects themselves. So, again, looking at Unity, you see the hierarchy with a list of objects in the scene, and then the project window where you get all of your assets that are within the entire project itself. Those are our objects. So things like models, sprites, sound effects, and other assets. Also prefabricated objects. Those are our game objects. The environment is the scene itself, a level, or even just the overall game program that we're creating within Unity, the project. Our attributes are components of our objects, that the type you'd find in the inspector. And those are the things that we add to our objects to make them interactive. So when we attach a script to an object, that's giving the object attributes. So if it's a game character, for example, it's like, how high can that character jump? How fast can they run? Those are the simplest versions of things. But remember, we can program whatever we want into our game. So these games, these game objects, if we design it well, can even start to take on meanings. The internal relationships are, of course, how these elements interact when we hit the play button and start playing the game itself. So when we're looking at games, we want to focus on two kinds of systems that Salin and Zimmerman describe when we describe transformational games. The first is formal systems, a system defined by its component physical attributes that can be observed and measured. This is the video game itself. This is your game that we just had within Unity, where it is something practical. It's, something that we are assembling on screen. This is the actual, reality of the game itself. And then the other type of system, and this is very, very important for the type of studying we're doing especially, is the cultural system. A system defined by how the game or the object interacts with other contexts such as society, language, or history. So, I looked at Unity, but let's look at a familiar non-digital game so that we can get an idea, but also understand how it's not just video games and game engines where this occurs. So first thing we have are the objects of chess. So objects are, quite simply, the chess pieces. Now their attributes are how these pieces move, how they capture opponents. What are the rules associated with them? How do we use them? Those are their attributes within a formal system of chess. So these are the rules of movement. The environment is the chessboard itself. So for example, if you have a bishop, the bishop that you have on the black squares can really only move... I really hope you can see my computer mouse right now, by the way, recording. I'm hovering it over the bishop that's on the black square, on the white side of the board. That bishop can move diagonally, but only in black spaces, because that's just the black spaces those are the spaces it's diagonal to. The bishop on the other side of the king and queen can do the same, but only on white spaces. That's the environment that this game takes place in. And then lastly, the internal relationships of all these pieces play out when we actually put this game in front of players and have people interact with the game. This is where the relationships in the game really play out, is when the game is being played, and especially among two actors. Actors, not people who act professionally, but actors, players, intelligences. So let's look at chess as a cultural system, though. Here we have to change the context. We're no longer looking at the game itself as something formal. That's called formalism. When you analyze something based on its formal components. Now we're going to look at its cultural context. So the first thing we have is chess as a game. Chess as a product that you can put in a box. That is the game of chess. Yes, chess as a formal object has component parts, but we are more interested in the game as an object itself. We can discuss this classification further in later lectures, but for right now, let's assume chess is a singular object. The attributes of chess, then, when we look at the culture of chess, take on an entirely different meaning. Here, the attributes of chess might be its history, how it went from an Indian military simulation to spread to the rest of the world. We might look at the cultural context. For the environment, we might look at the cultural context of chess matches. So what did it mean when, for the development of artificial intelligence, when Garry Kasparov lost to IBM's Deep Blue? The environment of chess is its historical context in terms of like specific famous matches. Like almost events in chess history, not related to the like historical facts of chess like its own history. But I guess the historical facts of chess being played and used. And then chess's internal relationships are when chess is referenced. How chess is something that can be mentioned, and then people have a vague idea of, the cultural context of chess. Chess is something that, maybe kids in the chess club play, and, there's certain social stereotypes involved with that. That's sort of a negative idea of chess, but maybe chess as something that very intelligent people play, or chess as something that, as part of a storyline on a show like The Simpsons that is itself very ingrained, a piece of, culture itself, but also referencing lots of other pieces of culture. Chess is a tentpole that can be put into this cultural conversation. Chess has internal relationships with other pieces of culture, and how those things intersect become chess's part of chess's cultural system. So this is much more abstract, but it starts to look at how, we understand games as things that affect the world around them, and games that can have stakes in other things, again, like pop culture, the development of artificial intelligence, world history, things like that. This gets us into talking about interactivity. Systems play out in the context of interactivity, which directly correlates with the idea of rules and feedback that we discussed last week. Rules and feedback are you interact with rules, and then the game gives you feedback based on your performance within those rules. Interactivity is an active relationship between two, and I'm going to add or more things to Salin and Zimmerman's definition here. And I say more things because, imagine a MMORPG, massively multiplayer online role-playing game. Each person is a thing that can interact. Each person is a player that has its own attributes that can interact with the system around it. So interaction can be, more multi-channel than just two. But, like systems, there are multiple types of interactivity. And I'm not going to totally, I'll summarize what's here. You can read. But cognitive interactivity, this is you mentally interacting with something. So how your mind interprets the stimuli of, in our case, the game. Functional interactivity is the practical relationship. So holding a controller, using a keyboard, moving pieces around on a board. That's functional interactivity for games. Explicit interactivity is when a user participates with your choices as a designer. You are making choices with the idea that somebody's going to interact with them, and then those choices you make in a game, where to put a block, where to end a level, how many enemies to put in a level. Not necessarily we're always working with enemies and things like that in a transformational game, but you as a designer arranging the elements of your game such that you create a play experience. Is it too hard, too easy? Is it a training level that teaches you how to play the game? Those are the things that are explicit interactivity. And then beyond the object interactivity, when an object affects the world around it, when it has cultural influence, or when it is a cultural system. So this is the type of thing where you put your meaning into the game and try to have it react to the world around it. So we're going to use another game most people have heard of as an example, Pac-Man. So imagine yourself in an arcade in the 1980s. You're deciding which game to play, and your journey of interacting with Pac-Man might look like this. So first, you've perhaps seen ads for your local arcade, or you see a poster, "We have Pac-Man." So the characters are kind of cute. They're kind of interesting looking. They're very different from, the other games that you see that are mostly shooters like Galaga. Well, I guess Galaga didn't come until a year later. Space Invaders. Those types of games that are usually zapping aliens. This is very different from zapping aliens, and you're responding to that. And then you go in and you look at the objects on the screen. You start to interpret these symbols. They're brightly colored. They're appealing. Again, they're different from other games you've played because you're just tired of zapping aliens like in Space Invaders. So you decide to play. But when you play, this process continues. As your brain interprets what's going on in screen, that is the cognitive interactivity between you and Pac-Man. So again, after you've decided to play, you move the joystick. To get Pac-Man through the maze. You might even grab the side or change your stance to balance yourself, as you drive the character through the maze. This is actually something that was described by game historian Kat Despira, how people actually, because it was just a joystick, would change their stance or grab the side. If you look at unaltered old Pac-Man machines, ones that haven't been restored, you might actually see on the left side a place where the paint is worn away because people have been holding that side. That's functional interaction and the practical element of how a person deals with this physical object. That is your functional interactivity. You're, of course, playing a video game that was made by a person, Toru Iwatani, and some others, but Toru Iwatani is the father of Pac-Man. Iwatani made decisions about how the maze was laid out, how Pac-Man moved, how often fruit appears, that fruit appears at all. He made decisions about what the dots and power pellets do. He also made decisions about how the ghosts chase the player. When you play, you're interacting with the decisions and the challenge or experience that a designer like Iwatani has made. These are things that a human created. And that's the explicit interactivity, is you as a player interacting with that designer's choices. Because those choices affect your experience of the game. And then lastly, too far. When you leave the... Let me catch up on my notes. When you leave the arcade, you might talk to your friends about playing Pac-Man. Hey, I saw Pac-Man. It's amazing. You got to go play it. It's down at the fun spot, whatever your town's arcade was called. After a few of them have played, maybe you compare scores. These are things that occur outside of the game of Pac-Man itself, but are intrinsically linked to Pac-Man. Pac-Man is a very popular game. You might have bought in the 80s a Pac-Man shirt. You might still buy a Pac-Man shirt. You might have heard the song on the radio, Pac-Man Fever by the band Buckner and Garcia, who, oddly enough, was from Akron. That was a very popular novelty song around the time of Pac-Man being popular. And then years later, you get on your computer and you might open Google and see that the Day's Doodle is an interactive Pac-Man game. So this is Pac-Man affecting the world around it, both through, play-based things like high score comparisons to music and, cultural impact and referencing. So the last thing we're going to look at before we get into the types of games is design. You might hear people talk about design as the actual labor of making media, using a game engine or working with a digital art program. But that's not what we want to talk about when we talk about design. Design is really more of a creative process. It's understood as something more ethereal. It's the act of creativity. It's the process of synthesizing constraints and ideas. Constraints being the conditions of, an architect has a site, a game designer has computer specs that they have to work within, or the limitations of an engine or something like that. You're interacting with the technical aspects of the game, but you're really making creative decisions about problem solving. So it's the process by which a designer creates a context to be encountered by a participant from which meaning occurs, or meaning emerges. So let's look at this again. And here's another slide with a list of 4 things. So let's say you have a game designer. There's a game designer, person designing a game. And the context they make for their players, so their participants are their players. You make a context. That context is the game you're making. And then what happens when the player plays your game? Maybe, you're showing a parent your game or a grandparent the project you've worked on. Maybe your transformational game actually succeeds in its mission and positively impacts somebody's life. Maybe the person playing just really likes your game and it puts a big smile on your face. That's the that's the meaning that occurs when you make a game is what effect it has on the person outside it, even if it's just as simple as to make them happy and to have them have fun. That can be, for game designers, that's a really uplifting experience. So, the meaning could be as simple as that. But this is what we're talking about when we talk about a designer. So, okay, design basics out of the way. We're going to look at a list of transformational game types as described by the transformational framework. These types are distinguished not only by the type of gameplay in them, but which can be anything, but more by what their missions are. So if we look at traditional game genres, platformer, shooter, action game, meditation game, things like that, those are genres based on what you do in a game. Survival horror, based on topic area, things like that. But this is based on what type of mission they have. And quickly, I'm going to, pardon the word soup here, but here's how we're going to synthesize everything from the previous slides into how we approach these game types. The purpose of a slide like this is to show how games and design decisions go beyond placing objects within a 3D interface, but that every decision you make shapes the user's experience. So in this types of game making, that's really important to understand, since our goal is for the player to have been impacted by our game. So again, designers, you're creating systems. Those systems are interactive, and they facilitate transformation in our participants. So these systems are functional systems in that they have functional components, but they're also cultural in that they interact with the culture around them. So as a designer, you want to pay close attention to how the elements of your game shape the interactions that person has beyond the game world. That's going to be the meaning of your game. Again, word soup, but it's synthesizing kind of our mission statement of how we design. All right, so the first type we're going to look at are educational games. So educational games is a term applied to games that are usually for students and for teaching. I will say not all of the games we're going to look at fit neatly into only one genre. So, there might be examples from multiple genres. And that's where, you might look at this and you might look at this and it say like, well, that's also kind of like this other game. That's okay. None of these are really hard and fast. They blend a lot. So educational games are often for kids, but their age appropriateness is based often on how complex the subject matter being learned is. This game, Immune Defense by the company Molecular Jig, teaches players how an immune system works by putting you in charge of cells fighting off invading pathogens in a real-time strategy game. This game was developed by real biologists to educate kids on very complex topics using a very complex game genre. But because of how the designers arranged the challenge of their system in the first 4 levels specifically, it actually works. It ramps you up pretty nicely to the point where you get a nice, easy, ease into the full system of the game. And by the 4th level, you understand everything there is to know about the game, but then you also understand how the cell works because it's a very realistically designed game based on the processes of how the immune system actually works. Not all of these are digital. Evolution is a game that was pitched to game publisher North Star Games by an educator wanting to teach kids about evolution. In this game, you manage creatures and add traits to them so that they can survive from round to round and in ever-changing environments. Next are serious games. Like we said last week, this is a very popular catch-all term that applies to transformational games in general. Based on this list, I wouldn't call this a genre as much as an alternate term for transformational game, though it is helpful for describing games made to downplay the playful aspects of these games. And that sounds harsh, but that's why a lot of people who design games in this area, this transformational games area, don't really like the term serious game. It is useful to know this term though, and to use it when talking to non-game audiences who may be unfamiliar with the beneficial side of games and may be perhaps hesitant to work with games for their mission. So this is a good convincing term when you are working with potential clients. True serious games address their topic areas in pretty straightforward terms. So little fantasy, not much fantasy, I mean. So in last week's lecture, you saw a training simulation game about patient management in hospitals. The game had a literal hospital room, a literal patient, simulated equipment, and so forth. This game, Cyber Threat Defender by Hazardous Software, is a strategy game that helps companies visualize potential threats to their internet security using real data. The game is presented with some cool graphics, but is overall pretty straightforward. And as Chris Hazard, who owns Hazardous Software, can tell you, studies show that games used in training like this can be more effective if you recreate the setting and situations more straightforwardly than if you, say, layered a fantasy or sci-fi setting on top like you would with an entertainment game. So try to think about that in terms of how cognitive interaction becomes interpretation, becomes real-world effects. For games like this, having something that looks a little more literally or represents a little more literally the real world is going to be a bit more effective. Next, and again, here's an example of how these things blend, is training simulations. Games that let you perform simulated real-world tasks such as a training exercise. Again, here's virtual patient management. This is an example where serious game isn't a genre. This game is better described as a training simulation, even though I mentioned it on the serious game slide. So it's a training simulation that would fit into the serious game umbrella, which again, we're going to use transformational game. And so serious and transformational are again interchangeable and not a genre. Its genre is training simulation. So you see a simulated room, simulated tasks, and things you would really say to a patient. The delivery is very straightforward because this is something meant to prepare someone to do this in their real world job. Next, you have behavior change games, games that emphasize or show the value of quote-unquote good behaviors to change the habits of players. In these games, the designer's design decisions emphasize good behaviors that the designer feels the player should adopt and discourages or steers player away from bad actions. Again, here's that, the explicit interaction. So the cybersecurity game from the Serious Games slide by Hazardous Software was one of these. It showed you how bad security habits could hurt your network and rewarded you when you made good security decisions. In these games made by some of my former students, one was called Onward and the other Life Quest. The students were trying to create games to assist people on parole in their parole processes. The game sent players on quests, like making a resume or avoiding alcohol, which they would accomplish in the real world and then check back into the app. The app then gave the players in-game character experience points, which they could use to advance the game's story. So it was like a role-playing game, but you did your missions outside of the game. Somewhat related to games, these types of games are games for health, which usually take the form of games where the player practices good habits. Where these differ from behavior change games is that the games are usually a blend of behavior change and education for things like taking medication or learning about treatments. Remission, for example, is a game that teaches players about cancer treatments and how they hunt down and eliminate cancer cells. Next are games that affect positive social change, which are usually called impact games, social good games, or games for change, after the yearly Games for Change festival in New York City. These are games whose mechanics are used to have players interact with a real-world issue from the point of view of a person affected by that issue. So here's a game called Pre-Shave by Sam Pavelin. It's a funny game where you use two difficult-to-control arms, each controlled by a separate mouse, so it's actually also a multiplayer game, to shave the hair from your body. The message here is that you are a Middle Eastern person preparing to go to the airport. You win the game by shaving enough to not be, quote-unquote, randomly selected for additional search by the TSA. The developer, who deals with this situation in his everyday life, wanted people who are not like him to know what it was like for him to go to the airport, and did so in a fun, challenging, and thoughtful way that nonetheless communicates a powerful message. Another game, Black Room by Cassie McQuater, is a surreal and meditative game experience that uses sprites from popular video games and historic video games to challenge how women are depicted in these games. The repurposing of famous game sprites and the way in which they are arranged makes players think about the topic as they see elements placed together in new ways. As you can see, these games also share a lot with empathy games, which are games created, the games designed to create an emotional response as a way to have players share in a small portion of another person's personal experiences. I've mentioned iThrive a few times already in this course, and one of your course materials, suggested course materials, is from them. But one of their big projects is the Critical Strengths Engine, which is a tabletop role-playing game system that emphasizes emotional development of characters over physical development, such as dexterity or strength. The system is designed to have players experience emotionally uplifting and meaningful adventures in exciting fantasy worlds that resemble the worlds of other games. So the experience is still like playing a game like Dungeons and Dragons, but you're forming more interpersonal connections. Another is Depression Quest, which we saw in the first lecture. This game is a choose-your-own-adventure style game made in the Twine engine about the experience of living with depression. Like many adventure games, Depression Quest presents you with choices of how to proceed, but blocks off the healthy choices, quote-unquote healthy, as a way to demonstrate how depression affects your decision-making abilities. Coupled with really excellent and evocative writing, this is a quick but highly meaningful and purposeful game that gets you thinking about the difficulties of living with a condition like depression. And then our case study game for this week is Acrasia by Doris Rush from her time at the Gambit Game Lab. So I've included some links from the game, not links, quotes from the game's website here. But unlike other transformational games that usually emphasize a quote-unquote right behavior, this game allows players to explore the rules of the system and make their own decisions. The game is one about dealing with drug addiction, and upon beginning the game, the player must collect pills, eliminating the decision to only play by avoiding the drugs. Beyond that, the way the game proceeds is up to the player and can result in multiple endings or interpretations. Finally, on the transformational game genre list, so this is the last one, are citizen science or crowdsourcing games. These are games that use network features to have players solve large-scale problems together. So one of the most famous examples of these games is Fold It by the University of Washington Center for Game Science. In this game, players encounter protein strains and must unfold them. This process allows scientists to make advances in medical research, specifically for cancer treatments. The game was created because there were issues too complex for single or small teams of scientists to solve, like, how to properly unfold these proteins to study them. So the problems with unfolding these proteins were made into a game and released to the public. So, when a small team tries to tackle this, it can take a long time, but if you turn the problem into a set of rules and then release that problem to the public, having hundreds of people working on this at one time produces much faster results that are still accurate if you've laid the rules out properly. Another was a game called Investigate Your MP's Expenses by the Guardian newspaper in the UK. This game was a response to a scandal about members of the British Parliament charging personal expenses to their government accounts. When they asked for expense reports from Parliament, the newspaper was given as a bit of a screw you tactic, was given unorganized tens of thousands of paper documents. The paper digitized the documents and turned to their readers by creating a game where players could gain points by reviewing documents and reporting irregular spending. Having this group-sourced effort drastically cut down the time the staff would have to spend poring through the documents. The last thing I want to mention, and these aren't genres, but there's more sort of like overall categories. There are two overall categories of these games, and it's important to know both. Not all games are made to address real-world issues. And most of the games you buy and are probably inspired by and play in your everyday life are entertainment-focused games. Sometimes, though, these entertainment-focused games are repurposed for transformational purposes. Your textbook designates these as intentionally designed or adapted transformational games. What we've been looking at throughout this lecture and last week are genres that are intentionally designed games. But I wanted to give a few examples of cases where commercial games were adapted for transformational uses so that you would know how these things are, used within educational environments and how potentially you could use them someday. Perhaps the most famous instance of this is the Assassin's Creed series, each game of which features a different historical setting. These games make liberal use of historically relevant and accurate people, places, and artworks, so history teachers have included the games in their classes. At one presentation during the Digital Games Research Association, or DGRA conference in 2013, I even saw a talk where Assassin's Creed 2 was the textbook, or rather text game, for a Renaissance history class. The screenshot, of course, you're seeing is, a historically accurate representation of some of the architecture in Venice. The story of Assassin's Creed in history classes has a twist ending, of course, where in 2017, Ubisoft Montreal, who makes Assassin's Creed, themselves added an educational mode called Discovery Tour to Assassin's Creed Origins, which was a game that had an ancient Egyptian setting. Players can explore the environment of the game and are given access to writings, photographs, maps, and other resources to educate you about the setting. This game mode also features no combat whatsoever, so it is truly a tour where players can, use it as an educational tool. Another game that's been repurposed for educational use is Minecraft. And it's hard to pinpoint one purpose, but it's been used for things such as recreating historic computer systems like the Turing machine, or acting as a medium for people to research and build ancient structures. Here's a famous piece of architecture reproduced in Minecraft. There have also been examples of the game used as a way to lead neighborhood revitalization projects, where urban planners recreate a neighborhood in Minecraft and asks residents to build the types of changes they'd like to see in their everyday environment. So that's it. Your project assignment for this week is to form your teams. The way that this will work is that I want you to go onto the pitch threads from last week's assignment, read all of the pitches, and respond to one that you like with your name and the skills you'd bring to the team. Please list any and all skills you think you can, and try to think of what would be the most helpful. If you have some skills with coding, for example, but you like doing concept art, but concept art is already covered on a team, then maybe think about pitching in your coding skills. Also, don't worry about whether or not you're an expert in any one area. Any experience is better than no experience. And you're here to spend time learning and practicing in this course. So, maybe even think about trying something new. If everybody, again, signs up to be a 3D modeler or a sprite artist, then you'll only end up with 3D models and sprite art. So try to learn some new things. This is practice time. This is for you to learn. Also, please restrict your teams to no more than 4. I will only allow bigger or smaller teams in cases where the section's roster has already completely split into teams of 4. Once you've done that, have a group representative email me with the first and last names of everyone on your team, as well as the team and/or game name. That'll be your team name. And I'll make your groups on Blackboard with these emails. To be clear, the deliverable is the email, and when I receive it is when you'll get your points. Lastly, your forum assignment this week is to describe a transformational game you've played and identify which category from today's lecture the game fits into. Also describe the game's functional or cultural systems and how they did or did not support the topic did or did not support the topic that the game was trying to educate you about. So that's it. Email me at ctotten@kent.edu with any questions, and I look forward to seeing you in class. Bye-bye.